Welcome to what will be our final Hamilton lecture. I know you guys are so disappointed and wish this could go on forever and ever and ever. But like all good things, they must come to an end. So for this lecture, we're going to be looking at miscellaneous literary devices in Hamilton. So we're going to start with the, the line, "I don't know what you heard, but whatever it is, Jefferson started it." So these will all be examples from other songs in the show that we just don't have the time to examine as closely as we have the others. Honestly, you could spend a whole semester on Hamilton. The idea is to give you some more examples of literary terms that will help you better identify them on your own. Feel free to go back and look at the lyrics of any of these songs. They're all posted under the additional lyrics examples. So for starters, we're going to talk about hyperbole, which is something we haven't talked about yet. The definition of hyperbole is exaggeration for a desired effect. The example of this that we're going to look at is when Lafayette tells Burr, "You are the worst, Burr," in the Story of Tonight reprise. Obviously, Burr is not the absolute worst, as they are fighting a war against oppression and tyranny. So Lafayette is obviously exaggerating to make a point that he is his least favorite person there. Paradox. A paradox, by definition, is a contradictory phrase that contains some measure of truth. This is another literary device. We really didn't have a clear example in any of the songs we looked at before. However, a great example of this is when Burr says to Hamilton just before Lauren's duel with Charles Lee, "Can we agree that duels are dumb and immature?" in the 10 Duel Commandments. So obviously this is a very ironic statement, as Burr ends up killing Hamilton in a duel later on over what most people would consider pretty petty reasons, or reasons that were dumb and immature. Allusions. Like I've said several times before in the earlier lectures, this show is absolutely crackerjack full of allusions. So we're going to look at a couple more from some different songs. So the first one is, again, an allusion is a reference to something outside of the material written, a reference that they expect you to know to understand what they're saying. And this one comes from the Schuyler sisters. Angelica says, "And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to compel him to include women in the sequel." And so this is obviously an allusion to the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote. And it states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And what Angelica is implying there is that it needs to be rewritten to include men and women. "Sit down, John, you fat mother," and the Adams administration is an allusion to another musical, 1776, in which the main character is John Adams. It follows the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of the nation. If any of you have seen it or would like to see it, if any of you are 90s children, you may recognize the actor who plays John Adams. His name is William Daniels. He's better known as Mr. Feeney from Boy Meets World. Another great one that's a nod to something else in the musical theater canon is when George Washington says in Right Hand Man, "I am the very model of a modern Major General." And this refers to a song by the same name in Pirates of Penzance. It's an opera written by Gilbert and Sullivan. One of the neat things that he ties in there is the modern Major General from the Pirates of Penzance is the father figure for the entire show. He has all these daughters that he's trying to get married off. And George Washington is the father of our country. So it's a pretty neat twist that he puts in right there. "Nobody Needs to Know" from Say No to This is an allusion to the same song, "Nobody Needs to Know," from the musical The Last 5 Years. This is a song that takes place when the lead male character is having an affair, which makes it rather appropriate for Say No to This when Hamilton's beginning his affair with Maria Reynolds. In Alexander Hamilton, it also says the $10 founding father, which is an allusion to the fact that Hamilton is the face on our $10 bill. I told you, the show is absolutely packed full with allusions. Do you believe me now? The line, "Ladies and a Winter's Ball," is an allusion to the Beastie Boys song, "Hey Ladies," in which they say the exact same thing. "The Boy Is Mine," which Eliza repeats several times in Helpless, is a nod to the R&B hit of the same name by Brandy and Monica. The song is actually a duel between two women over the same guy, which fits well with the idea of Eliza and Angelica both kind of wanting Hamilton. The line, "No stress, my love for you was never in doubt," and "Helpless" is an allusion to the song Ready or Not by the Fugees. The Liberty Bell. This is an interesting one. In Hurricane, Hamilton states, "I wrote my way out of hell, I wrote my way to revolution, I was louder than the crack in the bell." This is an obvious nod to the Liberty Bell, which you see here. In 1751, Pennsylvania, their colonial government actually paid £100 for the bell to be commissioned, and it was placed in what is now known as Independence Hall, and it arrived in August 1752. The metal was too brittle, and actually during the very first test strike, it cracked. It was recast twice, and it was rung on July 8, 1776 to announce our independence from Britain. The final crack date, there's a lot of stories about it, so it's not really 100% sure where the large crack occurred or when. There is a story that one source may be it was struck during a visit by Marquis de Lafayette in 1824. So we'll go with that one for just simplicity's sake, to keep it with Lafayette. Hamilton's growl and "Helpless" on the line, "As long as I'm alive, Eliza, swear to God you'll never feel." And "Helpless" is an allusion to Ja Rule. He's a famous rapper. He does that kind of growl in a lot of his romantic duets. And you can also hear Ja Rule on the Hamilton mixtape. And he's singing a duet, and he does show off that very same growl. The 10 Dual Commandments, both songs, is obviously an allusion to the biblical 10 Commandments that God gives to Moses on Mount Sinai. One last allusion, although there are way more examples we could look at. "We're going to fly a lot of flags half-mast," in Right Hand Man is an allusion to the tradition of flying the nation's flag at half-mast, halfway up the pole, as you can see in the picture here. And it's done this way to commemorate when someone important dies. Onomatopoeia. "You walked in and my heart went boom," which Eliza tells us in "Helpless." Boom is again meant to imitate the sound of something dropping on the floor. It's a new way of saying the old expression, "my heart hit the floor." Chickablow in Right Hand Man is Hamilton initiating a type of explosion. The cabinet battles. So these are a lot of fun. They were modeled after the Eminem movie 8 Mile and the rap battles that take place in there, or if you prefer the Pitch Perfect movies, think kind of the riff-offs that they have in there as well. So there's a lot of allusions, again, packed in here. The battles take place between Hamilton and Jefferson, and instead of, say, a back alley or an empty swimming pool, they're taking place in the middle of Washington's cabinet. So the first allusion is Jefferson says, "Ha ha ha ha, such a blunder, it makes me wonder why I even bring the thunder." And this is an allusion to Grandmaster Flash's song, "The Message." And then he says later, "And if you don't know, now you know, Mr. President," which is a nod to Notorious B.I.G.'s song, "Juicy." Synechdoche. This again is the piece of something representing the whole. Angelica says this in The Schuyler Sisters. She says, "I'm looking for a mind at work." The mind at work, is a symbol for the entire man. Obviously, she doesn't want to carry around a brain with her, but she's emphasizing the fact that the most important purpose in a relationship and the most endearing quality of a man would be his brain, his mental capacities. The other one that we could look at is the crown, which can refer to the British government, the Brits in general, the British Empire, and specifically to King George himself. Personification. In Nonstop, Hamilton comes in to ask Burr for help with a case, and Burr says, "Who's your defendant?" And Hamilton says, "The new U.S. Constitution," where they're actually talking about the Constitution as if it would be a person they would be defending in court. Fun fact, Burr and Hamilton had law offices side by side in New York City. They were co-counselors on the very first murder trial of a man named Levi Weeks. And Burr was even Maria Reynolds' divorce attorney, who was Hamilton's mistress. He then tells us, and the world was wide enough, Hamilton says, America, you sent for me. So it's talking about the idea of the nation of America sending out a call or a letter, some way of beckoning him in, again, personifying the country as a whole. And then Burr says, and wait for it, death doesn't discriminate between the sinners and the saints. He's talking about death as a person, which again is an old custom that we saw with Hamilton as well in My Shot, where we're talking about death as the idea that it has a choice. It can pick and choose who it wants to take. A simile, it's like Ben Franklin with a key and a kite. You see it, right? From Satisfied by Angelica. She uses this simile to explain the emotion that she feels. She's comparing the feeling when she meets Hamilton to the idea of electricity and Ben Franklin and his famous experiment with testing lightning and a key and a kite. It could also be considered an allusion to Ben Franklin in that same experiment as well. An extended metaphor. So we haven't really talked about this. We've talked about metaphors, but an extended metaphor is one that extends more than just a line or two, typically for an entire poem or a story or a song. Hamilton uses the idea of an extended metaphor in his ballad Hurricane. He's comparing the wrath and turmoil of the hurricane that he lived through on St. Croix as a boy to the mess that he's created for himself, both publicly, politically, and privately, through his affair with Maria Reynolds, and his adversaries finding out about it. So now what? So we've reached the end of our Hamilton journey. Now you get to take all of these tools and tricks that we've covered and see if you can apply them to more traditional poetry, both in the poems that you'll be reading and the poetry anthology, which is your final project in this class. You should be looking at your selected poems for the anthology much the way that we looked at these lyrics, dissecting them and answering the questions for each one that are laid out in the anthology assignment. But first, let's talk about your final discussion post. So you need to read Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven and Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est in your textbooks. Choose one of these poems and dissect it the way that we have the Hamilton lyrics and the way you're going to be doing for your anthology. Make sure that you give the following: rhyme, if it exists, meter, if it exists, at least 2 literary devices that will be quoted and cited, MLA format, and explained, 1 example of juxtaposition, and then what do you think the poem is trying to say? And how does the writer's diction and style lend to that theme? Your post must be 300 plus words long. You do not have any responses required for this, although you're always welcome to comment on your classmates' work. This post is worth 15 points, so make them count. I look forward to reading your anthologies, and I hope you've enjoyed this class. Hopefully you've learned a few things and maybe found it a little fun as well.